The pervasive damp chill of a November evening had settled over London, clinging to the brickwork of the university library like a shroud. Inside, the ancient building groaned softly, a cacophony of settling timbers and the distant, rhythmic drumming of rain against the immense Gothic windows. For centuries, this venerable institution, nestled deep within the city's heart, had housed the quiet secrets of history. But tonight, the atmosphere was less one of placid academic contemplation and more of barely contained, frantic urgency. Dr. Alistair Finch, a man whose features were perpetually etched with the concentration of someone staring through a telescope into the deepest chasms of time and space, ran a weary hand over his face. He was in his late 40s, his tweed jacket slightly rumpled, his hair thinning at the crown, but his eyes, piercing blue behind thick spectacles, held the unwavering, perhaps dangerous spark of true obsession. Dr. Finch wasn't dealing with dusty medieval manuscripts or polite, peer-reviewed articles on stellar evolution. He was dealing with a concept so explosive, so disruptive to the modern cosmological paradigm, that merely whispering its name in the hallowed halls of Cambridge or Oxford was enough to secure professional exile: Nibiru. For decades, the idea of a massive rogue planet orbiting the Sun on a highly elliptical 3,600-year trajectory, Planet X, the 12th planet, had been relegated to the intellectual dustbin, dismissed by astronomers as the stuff of sensationalist headlines and fringe conspiracy theories. It was, quite frankly, intellectual poison in the UK's rigorous scientific establishment. Yet here he sat, surrounded by towering stacks of books, sipping a cuppa that had gone stone cold hours ago, scrutinizing a printout from the ATLAS, Asteroid Terrestrial Impact Last Alert System, telescope network. The paper displayed the trajectory data of 3I Atlas, a celestial visitor whose behavior was, to put it mildly, deeply unsettling. What if the myths of ancient Mesopotamia, those sprawling, detailed accounts of the Anunnaki, the those who from heaven to earth came, were not allegories, but accurate historical records? What if the ancient Sumerians, writing on clay tablets thousands of years before Christ, possessed astronomical knowledge that dwarfed our own current understanding? The very notion made Dr. Finch's stomach churn, not with fear, but with a profound, thrilling sense of discovery. The current accepted narrative of planetary formation simply could not account for the observed gravitational perturbations in the distant reaches of the solar system, particularly beyond the Kuiper Belt. These distant ice worlds behaved as if something enormous, something unseen, was tugging at their orbits, subtly shifting their paths in ways that Newtonian physics suggested were impossible without a massive, unknown body lurking in the cosmic gloom. Mainstream astrophysics had coined the term Planet 9, a vague theoretical mass used to plug the gaps in their calculations, a sort of cosmic fudge factor. But Finch knew, deep in his gut, staring at the unsettling curvature of the 3I Atlas data, that Planet 9 was a sanitized cover story. The scale of the disturbance, the sheer volume of unexplained gravitational influence required, pointed not merely to a Neptune-sized gas giant, but to something far heavier, far darker, and moving along an orbital plane radically inclined to the rest of the solar neighborhood. He picked up a replica of a Sumerian cylinder seal, the intricate carvings depicting winged beings attending a massive, distinctly drawn planet, complete with moons, the Anunnaki. They were the key. Sitchin, the controversial translator, had argued that these beings came from Nibiru, a planet whose periodic return coincided with periods of massive cataclysm and, crucially, massive leaps in human civilization. Coincidence? Finch refused to accept that premise. The details regarding 3I Atlas were astonishingly specific. When it was first spotted, it was moving at an unnervingly fast clip, an interstellar comet streaking across our cosmic backyard. But as it began its loop around the Sun, The subsequent tracking data started to deviate wildly from predictive models based on known objects. It moved as if it were being gently herded, nudged by a gravity well of colossal proportions, yet one that remained frustratingly invisible to optical and infrared telescopes. The sheer difficulty in processing this information was why Dr. Finch had retreated to this isolated corner of the library. He needed silence, space, and a profound detachment from the polite ridicule of his peers, who would label this work as crank science or charlatan rubbish. He imagined Professor Harrington, his old departmental head, leaning back in his leather chair, tutting dramatically, accusing him of chasing ghosts rather than funding grants. Finch adjusted his spectacles, his fingers tracing the sharp lines of the comet's plotted route. The key lay not just in its speed, but in the angle of its approach and departure. 3I Atlas was performing a gravity assist maneuver, a slingshot that suggested it was using the gravity of something vast and heavy before it even reached the inner solar system, an influence whose source had to be far, far out in the dark abyss of space. This was not random cosmic debris. This was a billiard ball being subtly steered by a colossal hidden cue. He took a slow, deliberate sip of the freezing tea, the bitterness mirroring the professional isolation he had embraced for this research. The cold, logical data from Atlas was aligning with the mythological narratives of ancient Sumer in a way that defied all rational explanation, or perhaps demanded an entirely new definition of rationality. The Sumerians described Nibiru as having a cross symbol associated with it, representing its path across the solar plane. They described the Anunnaki arriving on Earth, initiating the great civilizations, and then retreating back to their world when its orbit took it away. It was a cyclical, terrifying history, written in mud and clay, now being echoed in cold, hard telemetry data broadcast from the high deserts of Hawaii, where the Atlas project tracked the skies. The implications were staggering, not just proof of a rogue planet, but perhaps proof of ancient superior life that had shaped the very trajectory of human evolution. He felt a deep, profound sense of urgency. The orbit of 3I Atlas, when meticulously back-calculated, pointed towards a specific region of the sky, a blind spot that mainstream science preferred to ignore. This spot corresponded precisely, uncannily, to the theoretical aphelion, the furthest point from the Sun, of the hypothesized planet X. The thought alone was electric. Dr. Finch felt a surge of energy, chasing away the bone-deep weariness of long nights fueled by subpar instant coffee and old biscuits. If he could prove this link, if he could show that a modern interstellar comet was being influenced by the mythological home world of the Anunnaki, it would rewrite history, theology, and astrophysics in one spectacular stroke. The challenge lay in translating ancient prophecy into verifiable modern astrophysics. It was a task that demanded not just intellect, but a willingness to commit professional suicide. Yet the beauty of the mathematics, the elegant confirmation of the Sumerian star maps, was simply too compelling to ignore. The tension was palpable. The weight of two disparate worlds, the ancient and the ultra-modern, was converging on his desk in this quiet corner of the library. If this beginning has already made you rethink everything you thought you knew, imagine what's coming next. So go ahead. Smash that like button and subscribe to the channel, because here, every video reveals something few have the courage to show. The next morning, the weak, grey light of a British winter morning seeped reluctantly into Dr. Finch's small flat in South Kensington. It was a cramped space, cluttered with decades of astronomical journals, replica cuneiform tablets, and stacks of printouts from deep space surveys. The air smelled of old paper and anxiety. Finch had barely slept, his mind churning over the complex orbital mechanics that defined the problem of 3I Atlas. The crux of his research, and the source of his current professional pariah status, was his absolute reliance on the contentious work of Zecharia Sitchin. Sitchin, a man despised by traditional Sumerologists, claimed to have translated the ancient texts, specifically the Enuma Elish and various cylinder seals, not as religious mythology, but as a detailed cosmic history. He described a colossal planetary body, Nibiru, often referred to as Marduk in later Babylonian texts, engaged in a dramatic celestial collision that shaped the very architecture of our solar system, creating the Earth, Tiamat's fractured remnants, and the asteroid belt. Finch, a trained astrophysicist, had spent years trying to reconcile Sitchin's often bombastic claims with mathematical reality. Initially, he approached the texts with deep skepticism, viewing them as historical curiosities. But the details were too specific, too astronomically accurate for a Bronze Age culture to have simply fabricated. How did the Sumerians know the precise composition and number of Jupiter's largest moons, or accurately detail the color and density of Uranus and Neptune, planets invisible to the naked eye? The key concept Sitchin provided was the SAR, the 3,600-year orbital period of Nibiru. This colossal period, far longer than Pluto's own 248-year orbit, explained why the planet remained hidden. For vast millennia, it receded into the cold, distant blackness of the Oort cloud, only to return fleetingly to the inner system, causing chaos, and, according to the Anunnaki narrative, providing the necessary gravitational leverage for the gods to descend upon Earth. Finch leaned against his small kitchen counter, nursing a fresh, scalding mug of tea. He looked at a high-resolution photograph of the Sumerian king list, which described rulers reigning for impossible lengths of time. SARs of years. Was this exaggeration, or was it a relative timescale based on Nibiru's vast cycle? To connect this mythology to the very real, observable anomaly of Three-Eye Atlas, Finch needed a mathematical bridge. Three-Eye Atlas was designated an interstellar object, meaning it originated from outside our solar system, perhaps ejected from a distant star's sphere of influence millions of years ago. It had entered our system with a high hyperbolic trajectory. However, its path was not purely parabolic, as expected for an interstellar visitor merely passing through. Its perihelion, its closest approach to the Sun, was erratic, and its subsequent trajectory out into the far reaches of space seemed to be subtly bent. Finch had modeled hundreds of scenarios on his bespoke computational cluster, a powerful, humming machine tucked awkwardly under his desk. He was searching for a gravitational source strong enough and, crucially, positioned correctly to impose that specific bend on Three-Eye Atlas's trajectory. If the planet was Jupiter, the influence would be immediate and obvious. If it was Neptune, similar. But this influence was originating from far beyond Neptune, almost certainly in the proposed realm of Planet 9, the Kuiper Belt scattered disk. Finch's models consistently spat out the same answer. The force required to deflect Three-Eye Atlas along its observed path necessitated a planet with a minimum of 10 Earth masses, positioned at an extreme inclination, about 30 degrees off the ecliptic plane, and currently residing somewhere between 400 and 800 astronomical units, AU, from the Sun. This was precisely the parameters predicted by Sitchin's reconstruction of the Nibiru orbit, where the planet spent most of its time in the icy abyss before returning. The convergence of astronomical fact and ancient myth was chilling. He remembered a lecture he gave 5 years ago, before the Atlas data was fully understood, where he cautiously presented his initial hypothesis, linking orbital perturbations to Sumerian cosmology. The room, filled with smug, well-funded academics, had erupted in quiet, controlled mockery. Professor Harrington had stood up, his face reddening slightly. "Finch, old boy," Harrington had sneered, adjusting his gold-rimmed spectacles. Are you seriously suggesting that we abandon 200 years of rigorous stellar mechanics because some chap from the 70s decided he knows better than the British Museum's cuneiform experts? This isn't a sci-fi serial, it's astrophysics. Stick to the data, man, not ancient whispers. The humiliation had been immense, but it only served to harden Finch's resolve. He knew the data was screaming a truth the scientific establishment was terrified to acknowledge. The official line was that 3I Atlas was merely exhibiting non-gravitational acceleration, a polite way of saying they didn't understand why it was speeding up or slowing down, usually attributed to outgassing from its icy core. But Finch's analysis showed the vector of the acceleration was too coherent, too directional, to be random jets of frozen gas. It was being pulled. He returned to the present, the cold tea doing little to warm his hands. He opened the file containing the orbital solution for 3I Atlas. He had overlaid his theoretical Nibiru orbit model onto the comet's path. The alignment was uncanny. The comet appeared to have passed through, or very near, the aphelion point of the hypothesized Nibiru orbit several years prior, receiving a colossal, distant gravitational kick that set it on its observed path towards the inner solar system. It was a cosmic hello from an object the world insisted did not exist. Finch felt the immense burden of being potentially the only person on Earth who grasped the true scale of this imminent discovery, or rediscovery. The Anunnaki weren't just characters in a legend. They were occupants of a colossal planet currently making its sluggish, long-anticipated turn back towards the heart of the solar system. If you've made it this far without pausing, it's because this has truly struck a chord with you. So strengthen this content, hit the like button now, and share this with someone who absolutely needs to see this deep dive. Dr. Finch began to trace the narrative thread of the Anunnaki, dissecting the Sumerian accounts to build a psychological profile of the planet's alleged inhabitants. The texts painted the Anunnaki not as benevolent, ethereal deities, but as powerful, technologically advanced, and profoundly materialistic beings obsessed with gold. They were the shining ones, often depicted with wings or flying apparatus, demanding obeisance from primitive humanity. Sitchin theorized, drawing heavily from the Sumerian accounts of Earth's early history, that the Anunnaki arrived on Earth approximately 450,000 years ago. Their purpose was pragmatic, to extract vast quantities of gold, which they supposedly needed to replenish the diminishing atmosphere of Nibiru. They used the gold as a suspended particulate shield, reflecting harmful solar radiation during Nibiru's long, cold sojourn in the outer darkness. The details of their operations were described meticulously in the texts. Landing in the Persian Gulf region, they established Eridu, place of faraway home, and set up mining operations, initially using their own lower-ranking personnel, the Igigi, for the back-breaking labor. However, the strain of the toil led to a mutiny among the Igigi. The Anunnaki leaders, specifically Enki and Enlil, faced a critical labor shortage. This moment, according to the tablets, became the inflection point for humanity's existence. To resolve the crisis, Enki, the chief scientist of the Anunnaki, proposed a solution, creating a Lulu Amelu, a primitive worker, using genetic manipulation, described in the texts with surprisingly clear biological terms, the mixing of essences and clay. The Anunnaki combined their own superior genetic material with that of Homo erectus already existing on Earth. This creation myth, Finch mused, was far more shocking than any biblical account. It suggested that humanity was not an accident of natural selection, but a deliberately engineered hybrid species created for servitude, specifically mining gold. Finch spent a significant portion of the morning detailing the chemical requirements. Gold, he knew, was crucial for atmospheric repair theories, primarily due to its stability and reflective properties in nanoparticle form. If Nibiru truly had a catastrophic atmospheric collapse, gold dust, widely dispersed in the upper atmosphere, would be a plausible, if extremely expensive, solution. He paused, running his tongue over the dry roof of his mouth. The implications were immense. If the Anunnaki were real, and if their planet was returning, then the current geopolitical obsession with gold, from national treasuries to central bank reserves, suddenly took on a terrifying pre-programmed significance. Was humanity, unconsciously, still hoarding the resource for its original masters? The story of the Anunnaki provided the why behind the potential return of Nibiru. The planet needed its resources. The data from 3i Atlas provided the when and the where. The convergence was almost suffocating in its certainty. He switched his focus back to the astronomical data. He had to be absolutely rigorous in his connection between the mythological orbit and the specific gravitational influence exerted upon 3i Atlas. The comet, being an interstellar object, was the perfect cosmic litmus test. Unlike objects native to our solar system, like Pluto or Sedna, which have been subject to the Sun's dominant gravity for 4 billion years, 3i Atlas was a relative newcomer. Its path was pristine, uncorrupted by millennia of subtle gravitational dances between the known planets. Any deviation in its hyperbolic trajectory had to be the result of a single, powerful, external force encountered during its brief transit through our outer sphere of influence. Finch looked at the raw data plots. The deviation point, where 3i Atlas began its anomalous turn towards the inner system, was located precisely at 650 AU, right where his model predicted Nibiru would have been approximately 6 years prior. He had developed a highly complex proprietary algorithm based on non-Keplerian orbital solutions, factoring in the relativistic effects of a 10 Earth mass body. The complexity was necessary to circumvent the inherent bias of standard astronomical software, which often defaults to ignoring gravitational influences that don't fit within the established 8-planet model. The scientific community, steeped in the comfort of convention, refused to consider anything outside the established parameters. Their refusal was less about scientific rigor and more about cognitive inertia. The possibility of rewriting the entire history of life on Earth, coupled with the existence of a planet that defies standard formation theories, was too much for the typical academic to stomach. Finch knew he was chasing a truth that would shatter civilizational complacency. He felt a deep, almost spiritual connection to the ancient scribes who had etched this story into clay. They weren't writing fiction. They were documenting the arrival and departure of colossal, powerful beings, whose return was scheduled like a cosmic clockwork mechanism. The details of the Anunnaki's departure were also critical. The tablets suggested that during the Great Flood, a cataclysmic event triggered, Sitchin believed, by the gravitational tidal forces of a returning Nibiru, the Anunnaki fled Earth, watching the destruction from orbiting craft. They later returned to restart civilization, building the post-flood cities, but their presence became sporadic as Nibiru began its long journey back out into the void. Their promise, etched into the foundational myths of Babylon, was simple. They would return when the King of the Heavens completed its circuit. And now, 3i Atlas, that tiny, icy messenger from beyond the stars, was signaling the imminent approach of the king. Finch rubbed his temples. The cold light of the morning made the dust motes dancing in the air above his desk visible, almost glittering. He considered the profound solitude of his work. He had shown this data to 2 trusted colleagues over the years. One had politely suggested he take a long sabbatical. The other had simply ghosted him, too terrified of the professional repercussions to even return a call. While Finch worked in professional isolation, the mainstream scientific community was grappling with its own internal crisis of confidence regarding the outer solar system, albeit one they refused to link to mythology. The crisis was known euphemistically as the trans-Neptunian object clustering problem. The Royal Observatory at Greenwich, a bastion of British astronomy, represented the established order Finch was challenging. From this hallowed ground, astronomers used the world's most sophisticated instruments to map the heavens. Yet the data coming in from the distant Kuiper belt was defying all their models. The dilemma was simple. Why did the most distant tiny bodies, the TNOs, seem to share strangely aligned orbital properties? They didn't just wander randomly, they clustered together, their orbits exhibiting eccentricities and inclinations that suggested they were being dynamically herded by the gravity of something massive. Dr. Eleanor Vance, a young, brilliant astrophysicist at Greenwich, was one of the lead proponents of the Planet 9 theory. She argued passionately that a planet roughly 4 times the size of Earth, residing between 200 and 1200 AU, would explain the TNO clustering. Her models were precise, peer-reviewed, and utterly devoid of any reference to ancient Sumer. Dr. Finch respected Vance's mathematical skill, but he felt her entire premise was flawed by a fundamental constraint. She was looking for a solution that fit within the standard model of planetary formation. A planet formed in the early solar nebula and migrated out. This assumption, Finch believed, blinded her to the possibility of an interstellar capture, or worse, a unique, highly elliptical orbit that violated standard stability calculations. Finch knew that Vance and her colleagues were already aware of the 3I Atlas anomaly. They dismissed it using the non-gravitational acceleration excuse, viewing it as a tricky, outgassing comet, entirely unrelated to the long-period TNO clustering problem. They separated the data streams, refusing to see the unified picture. What Finch saw was a single, colossal hand orchestrating both the long-term slow movement of the TNOs and the precise sudden acceleration of 3I Atlas. He meticulously reviewed the data on TNO 2012 VP113, nicknamed Biden by some irreverent astronomers, an object whose orbit was so eccentric that it spent most of its time in the absolute void of the inner Oort cloud. The calculation required to keep VP113 stable demanded the presence of a planet far larger than Vance's proposed Planet 9. If Planet 9 existed as described by Vance, a relatively stable distant body, it could only account for the clustering of the TNOs. But it could not account for the specific energy transference required to alter the velocity vector of 3I Atlas without being closer. The solution, the terrifying middle ground, was Nibiru, a planet so massive it could influence the TNOs from extreme range, and whose highly inclined long orbit meant it occasionally passed closer, still hundreds of AU away, to the trajectory of objects like 3I Atlas, delivering the precise gravitational kick observed in the comet's telemetry. Finch spent hours refining the visualizations of the orbits. He imagined the vast, empty space beyond Pluto, freezing cold and absolute blackness, filled only with the faint, cold light of the distant sun. And within that void, moving in majestic, silent solitude, was the behemoth Nibiru. Its mass was such that even at extreme distances, its gravitational shadow was long enough to subtly warp the geometry of space-time around it. He imagined the sheer political and scientific fallout if he published his combined solution. He would not only confirm the existence of Planet X, but he would also provide an orbital model that directly validated the ancient, discredited Sumerian texts. The entire edifice of academic archaeology and astrophysics would collapse under the weight of this revelation. The pressure was immense. What if he was wrong? What if all his sophisticated algorithms were simply aligning data points through confirmation bias? He stepped back from his monitor, the faint glow illuminating his tired face. The only way to truly confirm was to find independent verification of Nibiru's inclined orbital plane. the Sumerians claimed it was tilted, a key factor in why it remained hidden, as standard surveys focused on the narrow ecliptic plane where the 8 known planets reside. And then he remembered the specific details of 3I Atlas's inclination. It was not moving parallel to the solar system's main highway. It was diving in at a steep angle, mirroring the exact 30-degree inclination Finch had modeled for Nibiru's path. The comet was acting as a guide marker. It was a cosmic buoy, signaling the depth and angle of the vast hidden ocean of Nibiru's return. You've invested this much time, proving you have the curiosity to look beyond the surface. To strengthen this content, hit the like button now and share this with someone who needs to see how ancient myths are colliding with modern data. The entry of 3I Atlas into the interplanetary discussion was, for Dr. Finch, the moment the purely theoretical threat of Nibiru became a practical, observable phenomenon. The comet, officially designated C2019Y4, first caused a media flurry in late 2019 and early 2020, but not for its strange orbit. Initially, it was because it brightened dramatically, leading to optimistic predictions that it would become a dazzling naked-eye spectacle. But 3I Atlas proved to be a disappointment to the general public. Instead of blazing brightly, it began to fragment, breaking into dozens of smaller pieces as it neared the sun. Mainstream science attributed this to thermal stress or rotational failure, standard explanations for cometary disintegration. Finch, however, saw a different signature. He had run simulations specifically on the tensile strength of the comet's nucleus. For an interstellar object, frozen solid and largely pristine, the thermal stress of its relatively distant perihelion, closest approach to the sun, should not have been sufficient to cause such dramatic, violent fragmentation. He believed the fragmentation was caused by an extreme, non-solar tidal force acting upon the comet before it fragmented. He described this phenomenon to himself, sketching complex vectors on a large whiteboard that dominated one wall of his flat. Imagine the comet nucleus, a fragile, kilometer-wide structure of ice and dust held together by its own weak gravity. If it passed through the gravitational shear zone of a massive planet, even hundreds of AU away, the differential pull on the nearest and furthest sides of the comet could induce tremendous stress, creating fractures deep within the core. When 3I Atlas finally warmed up enough near the sun, those pre-existing structural weaknesses, inflicted by the distant tug of Nibiru, violently expressed themselves as catastrophic fragmentation. Finch had meticulously timed the onset of the fragmentation against his modeled trajectory of Nibiru. The numbers were terrifyingly close. The time 3I Atlas was calculated to have passed the point of maximum gravitational potential from the unseen mass correlated perfectly with the timeline of stress development leading up to its visible breakup. This link, Nibiru's tidal force causing the physical destruction of 3I Atlas, was the physical evidence he needed. It transformed the hypothesis from a vague theory about orbital clustering into a direct observation of Nibiru's gravitational handiwork. But how could he present this without invoking Sitchin? Finch knew he had to frame the argument purely in terms of dynamics. He needed to talk about massive, highly inclined perturber, MHIP, rather than Nibiru. He needed to make the mathematics undeniable before introducing the mythological context. He zoomed in on the data from the Hubble Space Telescope's observations of the fragmented comet. The debris field was not scattering uniformly. The fragments seemed to be pulled along slightly divergent, yet coherent paths. This demonstrated that the destructive force wasn't merely explosive, but directional, maintaining a subtle, continuing pull. Finch felt a pang of despair thinking about the bureaucracy. Submitting a paper detailing a massive, highly inclined perturber that perfectly matches the Sumerian descriptions of Nibiru to the monthly notices of the Royal Astronomical Society was a guaranteed path to rejection and ridicule. He needed a platform independent of the stifling hierarchy of UK academia. He stood up, stretching his aching back. He walked to the window, watching the rain beat down on the London pavement. The bustling life below, people queuing for the bus, carrying their shopping, oblivious to the cosmological drama unfolding hundreds of AU away, seemed impossibly fragile. He remembered a conversation he once had with his mentor, Professor Davies, long since retired. Davies, a man of deep faith and rigorous science, had once confided in Finch, "Alistair, the universe is much stranger than we allow ourselves to believe. Sometimes the oldest stories are merely history written by witnesses who lack the language to describe what they truly saw." This sentiment gave Finch courage. The Sumerians described the Anunnaki returning to their planet when it was far away, moving away from the sun. They described a crosser planet. 3 Atlas confirmed the existence of a highly inclined, massive object precisely where the Anunnaki needed their home planet to be. The next step in his analysis involved calculating the momentum transfer. How much kinetic energy did Nibiru impart to 3I Atlas? The sheer volume of this calculation required days of processing power. If the calculated energy transfer matched the theoretical tidal stress necessary to fracture the comet, the case was closed. Finch poured another mug of tea, the water spitting angrily in the electric kettle. He looked at his bespoke computing cluster, its fans whirring tirelessly. The machine was the silent witness to a cosmic collision of fact and folklore, a secret hidden in plain sight for millennia. His fate, and potentially humanity's understanding of its own origins, rested on the cold, hard numbers that were currently being crunched in the cramped confines of his little South Kensington flat. The isolation of Dr. Finch was not merely professional, it was physical. He lived and breathed this research. His flat, a standard British terraced conversion, had become a veritable fortress against external noise and distracting influence. The curtains were usually drawn, not for secrecy, but to minimize glare on his multiple monitors. He rarely ventured out, subsisting largely on microwaved meals and continuous streams of builder's tea. His obsession was a direct result of the lack of faith the UK establishment placed in him, following his initial, cautious inquiries into orbital anomalies a decade prior. He was a brilliant mind, yes, but he lacked the political savvy to navigate the labyrinthine funding bodies and peer review systems. He was, in short, a brilliant maverick, a type the British academic system often prefers to sideline. He reflected on his childhood in rural Wiltshire, gazing up at the dark, star-filled skies, dreaming of what lay beyond the familiar constellations. That youthful wonder had hardened into a desperate, focused adulthood, fueled by the terrifying realization that perhaps the most profound truths were dismissed as children's fairy tales. Finch needed to focus on the trajectory analysis of 3I Atlas with excruciating detail. The comet's path was not a clean hyperbola. It was a compound curve, a function of the sun's gravity interacting with the specific, highly inclined gravitational pull of the hypothetical MHAP, Nibiru. He began outlining the specifics of the orbital alignment. 1. The plane of influence. Nibiru, according to the Sumerian cosmology and Finch's models, resides on an orbital plane roughly 30 degrees inclined to the main solar system, the ecliptic. 3I Atlas entered our solar system at a similar highly inclined angle. This was the first key indicator. If Nibiru were merely another planet 9 on the ecliptic, 3I Atlas should have been affected differently. 2. The velocity anomaly. The comet's speed, when measured against the background stellar frame, showed a brief, unaccounted-for deceleration as it reached its theoretical aphelion influence point. This deceleration was consistent with the drag experienced as it entered the outer gravity well of Nibiru. It was, effectively, hitting a cosmic speed bump. 3. The directional change. Crucially, the long axis of the hyperbolic orbit had shifted slightly towards the south celestial pole after passing the influence zone. This indicated the perturbing mass was positioned below the ecliptic, perfectly aligning with Finch's calculations for Nibiru's downward swooping trajectory into the inner system. He meticulously documented these 3 points, creating dense graphs and charts filled with error bars and statistical proofs. Each line of data was a nail in the coffin of the established astronomical narrative. He imagined the sheer scale of Nibiru. If it was 10 Earth masses, it would likely be a gas giant similar to Uranus or Neptune, perhaps slightly smaller, but far denser, possibly with a core of exotic materials. And if it carried a sustained atmosphere, as the Anunnaki narratives implied, that meant it was warm enough to support complex chemistry, life. The physical description of the Anunnaki, tall, commanding, living for immense spans of time, made sense if they had evolved on a planet with a vast, slow orbit, experiencing cyclical periods of extreme cold, followed by brief, intense solar proximity. Their genetics would be adapted for longevity and resilience. Finch walked over to his map of the ancient Near East, pinned to the wall next to his celestial charts. He traced the lines connecting the initial Sumerian cities, Eridu, Ur, Lhasa. These were the landing zones, the initial mining outposts described in the tablets. He felt an intense connection to this distant past, realizing that the forces that shaped those ancient societies were the very forces he was now tracking with cold, hard scientific calculation. The weight of this dual reality, the ancient myth and the modern physics, was exhausting. He had foregone sleep, proper meals, and any semblance of a social life for this work. He knew that the moment he published, his quiet life would be obliterated. He would be targeted by mainstream skeptics, media pundits, and quite possibly by elements within global intelligence agencies who might view the knowledge of Nibiru's return as a threat to societal stability. Yet the mathematical elegance of the solution compelled him. He could no more ignore the alignment of the 3i Atlas path and the Nibiru orbit than he could ignore the force of gravity holding him to his chair. He focused on the final phase of the momentum transfer calculation, double-checking the figures for the tidal strain. This involved integrating the comet's physical properties, estimated mass and composition, with the modeled gravitational gradient of the MHAP at 650 AU. The result needed to be exactly within the known parameters for the stress tolerance of cometary ice structures. The computer hummed louder, the processing nearing completion. The tension in the flat was almost electric, mirroring the gravitational tension experienced by 3i Atlas years ago in the dark expanse of space. The story deepens with every calculation. If you're still here, you're clearly someone who values truth over comfort. So strengthen this content. Hit the like button now and share this with someone who needs to see the cold data confirming these ancient fears. The calculation finished. The screen flashed green, congruence established. Doctor, Finch sat back, momentarily stunned by the finality of the result. His analysis confirmed with a minuscule margin of error that the tidal strain exerted on 3i Atlas by a theoretical 10 Earth mass body at 650 AU was exactly 98.7% of the stress required to induce the observed pre-fragmentation fissures. This was not a coincidence. This was gravitational engineering on a cosmic scale. He had mathematically proven that the fragmentation of a specific interstellar comet was caused by the gravitational shear of a massive, hidden planet. A planet whose orbital parameters precisely matched the descriptions of Nibiru found in Sumerian clay tablets. This finding introduced the ultimate paradox for modern astronomy. The physical evidence of Nibiru was now manifest in the destruction of 3i Atlas, yet the scientific community insisted that the cause of the destruction was simply outgassing or inherent weakness. They refused to acknowledge the ghost in the machine. Finch had to explain the orbital mechanics of the situation in terms a layman could grasp, while still maintaining the intellectual rigor of the documentarian tone. The concept of the slingshot effect was central, but in this case, it was a subtle, distant version. Imagine our solar system as a vast, flat, spinning vinyl record. All the known planets move relatively on this disk. Nibiru, however, comes in on a highly inclined trajectory, like a colossal, massive golf ball approaching the record from above and below, dipping briefly near the edge of the grooves before soaring back out. When 3 Atlas, the interstellar object, entered the solar system, its path took it near the point where Nibiru made its deepest penetration into the Kuiper Belt Oort cloud region, hundreds of AU away. The gravitational pull of Nibiru acted like a massive magnet, tugging the comet. Crucially, because Nibiru was moving across the solar plane, not within it, the influence it exerted was not easily compensated for by the Sun's gravity. This tug resulted in 2 effects. 1. Orbital correction. It subtly bent 3I Atlas's trajectory, aligning it slightly more towards the Sun, ensuring the comet would be observed by Earth-based telescopes. Nibiru had, inadvertently or deliberately, sent a signal. 2. Structural damage. The immense gravitational differential created the internal stresses that led to the comet's eventual public disintegration near the Sun. Finch considered the possibility of deliberate engineering. Could the Anunnaki use their planet's gravitational influence to steer incoming objects? The thought was staggering. It suggested a level of cosmic mastery far beyond current human capabilities. If they could steer a massive comet, they could certainly ensure Nibiru itself followed its predictable long-period orbit with unnerving precision. He spent the next few hours cross-referencing this orbital solution with the ancient Sumerian star maps he possessed. The Sumerian astronomers described a time when Marduk, Nibiru, approached the bright star of the Anunnaki and described its interaction with the icy bodies of the deep. These poetic descriptions, when translated back into astronomical geometry, perfectly matched the gravitational interaction point between 3I Atlas and the MA chip's calculated position. This synchronization of data streams, ancient history, modern astronomy, and computational physics was the definitive proof. But it was proof contained solely within the 4 walls of his flat, proof that the established system was actively rejecting. He felt the immense weight of historical responsibility. He wasn't just finding a new planet, he was unlocking a historical trauma, a moment when humanity transitioned from a natural primate to a genetically modified labor force. And if Nibiru was returning, what were the implications for the gold reserves and for the Anunnaki's alleged long-term plan for their creation, humanity? Finch imagined the panic that would ensue if the knowledge of a 10 Earth-mass planet on a highly inclined 3,600-year orbit became public. The cyclical nature of the cataclysm, great floods, periods of geological upheaval, sudden climate shifts, would suddenly be explained not by random chance, but by the predictable gravitational tidal forces of the returning giant. The next phase of his documentation had to pivot from the physics of Nibiru's existence to the anthropology of its impact. He needed to show that the cataclysms described in every ancient culture, the deluge myth, the sudden destruction of highly advanced pre-flood civilizations, were all consistent with the predictable return of Nibiru. The physical evidence of 3I Atlas was the warning shot. Now he needed to detail the historical consequences of previous arrivals. The tension is mounting, connecting cosmic physics to human history. If you are still following this complex chain of evidence, it means you possess a truly inquisitive mind. So strengthen this content. Hit the like button now and share this with someone who needs to see the overwhelming evidence mounting against the status quo. Dr. Finch moved away from the screens, showing complex orbital solutions, and turned to his collection of geological and anthropological texts. The link between Nibiru's periodic returns and global cataclysms was the bridge that would make his findings relevant not just to astronomers, but to every person on the planet. The Sumerian tablets described a catastrophic deluge, a flood so immense that it wiped out almost all life on Earth. This event is paralleled in almost every known human culture, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the biblical Genesis, and various myths from Native American tribes and Polynesian islanders. The ubiquity of the flood myth strongly suggested a single, devastating global event, rather than localized flooding. How could the return of Nibiru cause a global flood? Finch outlined the mechanism. As Nibiru, a massive planet, nears the inner solar system, its sheer gravitational pull would exert immense tidal forces on Earth. This pull would affect not just the oceans, but the solid crust of the planet itself. He focused specifically on the geological records. He studied deep-sea core samples and records of glacial melt rates. 1. Tidal stress on the crust. The gravitational torque of Nibiru could induce massive tectonic activity, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and, most critically, slippage of the Earth's crust over its mantle, known as crustal displacement or Earth crust displacement theory. Such an event would instantaneously shift continental land masses relative to the poles, causing massive, rapid climate change and sudden geological chaos. 2. Ocean displacement. The most immediate effect would be the literal dragging of the Earth's massive oceans. As Nibiru approached, its gravity would create monumental tides, not just localized but global, sweeping across continents as the planet's gravitational field distorted the hydrosphere. The Great Flood was therefore an oceanic tidal wave of unprecedented scale, driven by the cosmic interference of Nibiru. Finch considered the specifics of the North Sea shelf, a massive, shallow area of water separating Great Britain from the European continent. Geological evidence shows massive, rapid sedimentation changes in this area, sometimes attributed to melting ice caps, but whose scale suggested something far more sudden and violent than gradual climate change. The gravitational perturbation of Nibiru during its last pass could have easily induced the rapid cataclysmic changes observed in the Doggerland region, the submerged territory linking Britain to the mainland. He found the concept terrifying, yet scientifically coherent. If the Sumerians documented the last pass, and modern geology documents the resulting chaos, the historical record validates the orbital physics inferred from 3I Atlas. The Anunnaki narratives also described their response to the impending disaster. They were aware of the approaching gravitational influence and the inevitable consequences. They built massive vessels not to save humanity, which they largely viewed as disposable workers, but to save their own personnel and their genetic experiments, including the animals on board. The origin of the Ark narrative. The whole story was a blend of celestial mechanics and political indifference. The gods were not omnipotent. They were merely powerful beings fleeing the predictable consequences of their home planet's orbit. Finch leaned back, his mind processing the sheer scope of the historical cycle. If the last pass caused the Great Flood approximately 12,000 years to 13,000 years ago, a date often associated with the end of the last ice age and the sudden disappearance of megafauna, and Nibiru's cycle was 3,600 years, then its next return was still centuries away, giving humanity time to prepare. But the Sumerian texts were inconsistent regarding the exact orbital period. Some translations suggested a Sa could be slightly shorter or longer, and Nibiru's orbit, being highly elliptical, could be influenced by Jupiter and Saturn, causing slight variance in its return time. The urgency provided by 3I Atlas wasn't that Nibiru was coming tomorrow, but that it was currently at its maximum gravitational influence range, positioned to affect the outer solar system. This meant the period of its rapid acceleration towards the Sun was beginning. The warning shot had been fired, and the time for academic debate had ended. The world needed to know that the threat was not abstract, but verifiable through physics. He imagined attempting to convey this information to the British government, trying to convince some sensible minister in Whitehall that ancient Mesopotamian texts, validated by a highly inclined interstellar comet's destruction, meant they needed to start preparing for global tidal waves. The response, he knew, would be polite dismissal, followed by an immediate referral to a mental health professional. The mainstream scientific community's rejection of the Nibiru hypothesis was not passive, it was aggressive, bordering on the hysterical. Finch remembered the virtual conference he attended earlier that year, a sterile environment of webcams and mute buttons where he tried to present his initial correlations. The atmosphere was toxic. When he cautiously introduced the concept of a periodically returning MA chip and referenced the inclination data from 3i Atlas, Dr. Vance from Greenwich, the proponent of the smaller, stable Planet 9, attacked with ferocity. "Dr. Finch," she had stated, her voice tight with disdain over the video link, "your correlation between 3i Atlas and some hypothetical, highly elliptical body is mathematically spurious. You are fitting the data to an answer you desire, not drawing the answer from the observed facts. The fragmentation of 3i Atlas is entirely explained by thermal outgassing. The notion of a rogue planet on a 3,600-year orbit is merely a rebranding of a discredited myth, and frankly, it is damaging to our professional credibility to even discuss it." Her attack was brutal and effective. It was the standard dismissal: conflate the robust orbital math with the fringe mythology, and then discredit the whole package as crackpot theory. Finch had tried to defend himself, but Dr. Vance, the inclination of the initial hyperbolic trajectory of 3i Atlas is completely anomalous. It suggests an external, inclined influence. Why refuse to model the possibility of an MHIP with a 30-degree inclination? Standard formation models do not preclude an interstellar capture. She had simply cut him off. "We deal in known physics, Dr. Finch, not the fantastical interpretations of cuneiform tablets." The resistance was intellectual, but Finch suspected it was also institutional. The status quo is comfortable. A stable solar system, governed by predictable physics, allows for peace, funding, and career advancement. A solar system governed by a periodic, cataclysmic giant, one that suggests ancient intervention and potential future disaster, is politically untenable. Finch understood the fear. If Nibiru was real, it implied two terrifying realities. First, that humanity was created by a superior alien race, and second, that our existence is subject to their planetary schedule. These truths fundamentally undermine every major religion, every political system, and every scientific theory of human origin. He looked at his own reflection in the dark screen of his monitor. His face was drawn, his resolve hardening with every academic slight. He realized that the only way to bypass the intellectual gatekeepers like Vance was to go directly to the public, presenting the data stream in such a coherent, undeniable manner that the sheer mathematical proof overwhelmed the ideological resistance. He began structuring his eventual public release, a highly detailed yet accessible breakdown of the 3i Atlas trajectory. He would present the comet as the ultimate independent third party, a cosmic witness whose fragmented body offered irrefutable proof of a giant, unseen gravitational neighbor. We are entering the final, most crucial stages of this investigation. If you have the tenacity to keep up with these complex theories, you are part of an elite audience. So strengthen this content. Hit the like button now and share this with someone who needs to see the overwhelming evidence mounting against the status quo. The real breakthrough came later that week, when Dr. Finch received an unsolicited, encrypted file via an anonymous email server. The sender used a highly sophisticated, military-grade encryption key. The file contained not theoretical models, but proprietary tracking data from a deep space sensor array maintained by an undisclosed government entity. likely the US military or a European equivalent, judging by the satellite identifier codes. The data was raw, unsanitized telemetry on 3 specific TNOs that orbit at extreme distances, over 1,000 AU. These TNOs were too dim, too distant, and too far off the ecliptic to be routinely monitored by civilian observatories like Atlas or Pan-STARRS. This was surveillance data of the deepest, darkest void. The data leak was a godsend. It provided empirical, government-verified tracking of objects far beyond the range Finch had relied upon, objects that were even more sensitive to Nibiru's gravitational pull. Finch immediately fed the new telemetry into his M-ship model. The results were instantaneous and breathtaking. The 3 ultra-distant TNOs exhibited pronounced long-term orbital precession, a slow, wobbling shift in their elliptical paths. This precession was entirely inconsistent with the mass and position of Dr. Vance's theoretical Planet 9. It was, however, entirely consistent with a planet the size of Nibiru, positioned precisely where Finch had modeled it using the 3I Atlas trajectory. The implications of the leak were twofold. 1. Confirmation. The data leak confirmed beyond any statistical doubt the existence and mass of the massive, highly inclined perturber. The long-term tracking of the deepest TNOs provided the necessary time series data to stabilize the 3,600-year orbital calculation. 2. Concealment. The fact that a government agency was tracking these specific, distant, highly inclined objects with military-grade precision proved that powerful entities were not merely ignorant of Nibiru, they were actively monitoring it. They knew. The establishment was not merely skeptical, it was complicit in a deliberate global cover-up. Finch felt a surge of cold fury. All the ridicule, the professional setbacks, the constant dismissal, it was all designed to quarantine the truth. They were allowing the academic world to debate the existence of an abstract Planet 9, while secretly tracking the real, terrifying Nibiru. He looked around his flat. If this leak were traced back to him, his life would be over. The consequences of exposing a global conspiracy of this magnitude would be severe, extending far beyond the polite dismissal of an academic conference. He spent 2 sleepless days integrating the leaked data, refining the trajectory map of Nibiru's approach. The updated model now placed Nibiru's next perihelion, closest approach to the Sun, not centuries away, but alarmingly closer. The cyclical influence of Jupiter and Saturn combined with the extreme mass meant the orbit was slightly shorter than the maximum 3,600 years. The revised calculation estimated that Nibiru would re-enter the inner solar system's gravitational sphere of dominant influence within the next 150 to 200 years. While not an immediate threat, it meant the planet was already in its acceleration phase, swinging rapidly around its distant aphelion point. The time for humanity to understand its origins and prepare for the next gravitational cataclysm was shrinking rapidly. He saved the final integrated orbital solution under multiple encrypted aliases. He knew he could not publish this through traditional channels. The paper would be suppressed, the data seized, and his reputation destroyed beyond repair. He needed a medium that thrived on immediate global dissemination, a documentary format, one that could package the complex physics into an undeniable narrative. The knowledge of the cover-up added a layer of profound moral obligation to Dr. Finch's work. Why would governments hide the existence of Nibiru? The answer was simple: control and mass panic. If the public knew that a cataclysmic event was scheduled for 2 centuries hence, the immediate reaction would be economic collapse, societal breakdown, and religious hysteria. Political leaders thrive on short-term stability, not long-term existential threats. They would choose to keep the secret, perhaps preparing contingency plans for the elite, while allowing the vast majority of humanity to remain blissfully ignorant. Finch considered the possibility that the ongoing global obsession with space exploration, particularly the push to establish colonies on Mars, was not merely about scientific curiosity, but about finding a secondary habitat for the wealthy and powerful ahead of Nibiru's return. Could the massive government budgets poured into projects like the Artemis program be a subtle, desperate preparation for the ultimate evacuation? This narrative of deceit was as chilling as the astronomical data. The very institutions designed to protect and inform the public, scientific journals, space agencies, and governments, were actively collaborating to maintain the illusion of a stable, 9-planet solar system. He refocused on the 3I Atlas data, using it as his public-facing Trojan horse. The comet was the smoking gun that couldn't be ignored, even by the most cynical observer. He drafted the public statement he would eventually record, focusing on the simplicity of the observation. An interstellar object, untouched by 4 billion years of our solar system's evolution, entered our neighborhood. Its path was then violently altered, and its structure fractured by a gravitational force that does not belong to any known planet. That force is Nibiru, and the mathematics that prove its existence align perfectly with the ancient history of the Anunnaki. The connection had to be seamless. He would use the comet to prove the physics, and then use the physics to validate the mythology. He then delved into the specific details of Nibiru's atmosphere, as described by Sitchin's controversial interpretations. The Sumerians spoke of a shining veil and a reddish hue. This suggested a planet that, while a gas giant, might possess massive metallic dust storms or highly reflective atmospheric layers, consistent with a planet that was actively using gold particulates to reflect solar radiation over its long journey. The descriptions of the Anunnaki themselves, their incredible height, their ability to manipulate genetics, their obsession with a specific resource, all pointed towards a highly evolved civilization adapted to the extreme environment of a colossal, slow-orbit planet. They were not gods, but long-lived, resource-hungry extraterrestrial overlords. Finch felt a renewed sense of urgency. The leak of the government tracking data proved that Nibiru was being treated as a real threat, not a fringe theory. He had to assume that his identity would eventually be compromised, but the risk was necessary. The truth had to escape the confines of his flat. He started preparing the visual aids for his eventual documentary. He created dynamic 3D models of the solar system, featuring the familiar orbits of Jupiter and Saturn, and then, slowly, dramatically, introducing the massive, inclined elliptical orbit of Nibiru, crossing the ecliptic at a terrifying, steep angle. And then he plotted the tiny erratic path of 3I Atlas, showing its definitive gravitational interaction point with the behemoth. The visual proof was the most compelling argument. Seeing the data align was one thing. Seeing the orbital planes intersect in a dramatic, undeniable way was quite another. We've crossed the threshold of undeniable evidence, confirming not just the planet, but the cover-up. If you have followed this relentless pursuit of hidden knowledge, you belong on this path. So strengthen this content. Hit the like button now and share this with someone who needs to see the overwhelming evidence mounting against the status quo. With the integrated military data, Dr. Finch was able to produce his most critical piece of evidence, the definitive trajectory map of Nibiru's current position and its predicted path towards the inner solar system. The trajectory was a colossal ellipse, stretching hundreds of AU into the Oort cloud. Finch calculated that Nibiru was currently located somewhere between 450 AU and 500 AU, moving towards its perihelion. Critically, its movement was accelerating, dragged by the colossal gravity of the Sun, which had begun to dominate its momentum. He visualized the path. 1. The outbound leg, aphelion. The planet spent most of its 3,600 years in the icy darkness, moving slowly, barely registering the sun's light or warmth. This phase was the reason the Anunnaki needed massive amounts of gold to maintain their atmosphere. 2. The acceleration phase, current. Nibiru was currently transitioning from slow drift to rapid approach. This acceleration was precisely why its gravitational influence was suddenly detectable in the erratic behavior of highly sensitive objects like 3I Atlas and the ultra-distant TNOs. The path was terrifying because of its highly inclined nature. Nibiru would not simply join the queue of planets, it would cut across the solar system at a sharp angle. He meticulously documented the projected consequences of this specific path on the inner solar system, Jupiter and Saturn. The gravitational influence would subtly but measurably alter the orbital periods of the giant gas planets, potentially destabilizing their moon systems. This effect would be observable long before Nibiru reached Earth. The asteroid belt. As Nibiru crossed the solar plane, its gravity would scatter massive amounts of space debris from the asteroid belt and the Kuiper belt, sending an avalanche of rogue asteroids towards the inner planets. This influx of cosmic projectiles would be the first tangible sign of its near presence. Earth. When Nibiru eventually passed near Earth's orbit, the tidal forces would reach their peak, resulting in the predicted crustal displacement and global deluge that had occurred during its previous pass 12,000 years ago. The map Finch created was not merely predictive, it was a warning. It pinpointed the celestial coordinates where Nibiru would be observable by specialized infrared telescopes within the next 2 decades. Provided they were pointed at the correct, highly inclined sector of the sky. He knew this was the key to forcing the hand of the establishment. They could deny the myths and ridicule the fragmented comet data, but they could not deny the mathematical prediction of where a massive planet must be located based on the collective anomalies of the outer solar system. Finch spent hours reviewing the precise timing of the 3I Atlas fragmentation against the calculated gravitational peak. He was looking for any potential error, any subtle flaw that his critics could exploit. He found none. The physics was relentless and unforgiving. The comet was a beacon, destroyed to signal the approach of the colossal. He realized the immense irony. The comet, which had brought initial fame and then subsequent professional disgrace due to its erratic behavior, was now the single most important piece of forensic evidence proving the existence of the Anunnaki's home planet. It was a cosmic breadcrumb trail left by a force the world was determined to ignore. He finalized the documentation for public release, ensuring every step of the calculation, from the Sumerian context to the leaked military telemetry, was defensible. He had to be prepared for the inevitable, vicious counterattack from the scientific establishment and the intelligence agencies determined to maintain the cover-up. The sheer scale of the truth he was about to unleash demanded absolute precision and unwavering confidence. He took a slow breath, the cold London air doing little to calm his racing heart. Dr. Finch was ready to go public, but one final recent discovery cemented his confidence and provided a last devastating blow to the Planet 9 hypothesis. NASA had recently reported the discovery of a vast uncatalogued swarm of small, highly inclined objects beyond Neptune, nicknamed the Dark Asteroid Field. These objects were not clustered neatly, like the TNOs used to justify Planet 9. Instead, they were dispersed widely, but all shared a common high-inclination orbit. Mainstream astronomers were baffled, describing the field as a cosmic curiosity that defied the standard models of solar system dynamics. Finch, however, immediately recognized the signature. This dark asteroid field was not debris. It was the gravitational residue of Nibiru's previous pass. He modeled the theoretical impact of Nibiru's last close encounter, approximately 12,000 years ago, on the outer Kuiper belt. A planet of Nibiru's mass, crossing the ecliptic at a 30-degree angle, would rip a massive chunk of material from the outer reaches of the solar system, scattering it into a chaotic, highly inclined field. The recently discovered dark asteroid field perfectly matched the predicted dispersion pattern and inclination caused by Nibiru's previous transit. It was fossil evidence of the cataclysm, confirming the violence of Nibiru's crossing. This new evidence was the final, indisputable link. 3I Atlas showed Nibiru's current gravitational pull, the TNO precession showed its long-term influence, and the dark asteroid field showed the physical damage left behind by its last cataclysmic visit. Finch printed the technical paper detailing the dark asteroid field's correlation with the Nibiru model. He felt a profound sense of closure, mixed with dread. The mathematics was now unimpeachable, the mythology was validated, the cover-up was exposed. He thought of the Anunnaki, those long-lived complex beings who designed humanity for mining. What would their reaction be upon returning to find their primitive workers had developed nuclear weapons, global communication networks, and yet remained utterly oblivious to their own origins and the cyclical doom contained within their solar system? The documentary framework required him to maintain the tension, never providing absolute certainty, but rather offering a terrifying, open-ended conclusion. The truth of Nibiru was not a neat scientific discovery. It was the beginning of an existential reckoning. He prepared the final narrative sequence, focusing on the future implications. If Nibiru was accelerating, and if the dark asteroid field proved the cyclical nature of the gravitational chaos, humanity had little time to transcend its current limitations. He imagined the quiet, academic flat in London dissolving into the cosmic reality of a returning planet, its massive shadow stretching across the millennia of human history. The rain had stopped outside, and a cold, clear moon was now visible, shedding a pale light on his desk, the light of a solar system that was far less stable and far more anciently complicated than anyone dared to admit. He had gathered the proof. Now he just needed to find the courage to hit send on the digital files he had prepared. The future of human consciousness, perhaps, depended on this highly illegal, professionally ruinous act of defiance. Dr. Finch reviewed his comprehensive findings one last time. The narrative arc was complete. The ancient Sumerian accounts provided the blueprint. The orbital clustering of TNOs suggested the gravity well. The erratic trajectory and fragmentation of 3I Atlas confirmed the inclination and tidal influence of the massive planet, and the dark asteroid field provided the geological fossil evidence of its last cataclysmic pass. He had created a document that served as both a scientific paper and a historical warning. It was the culmination of decades spent fighting the complacency of his peers in the UK academic system, a system that valued comfortable ignorance over unsettling truth. The final question remained: what now? If the evidence was real and the scientific establishment was complicit in the concealment, then humanity was staring down the barrel of a cosmic gun, blind to the threat. The time for quiet peer review was over. The time for the truth, no matter how disruptive, had arrived. The return of Nibiru, signaled by the path of a tiny, fragmented comet from beyond the stars, meant that humanity's history was about to repeat itself. He looked at the precise, calculated trajectory. Nibiru was moving. Its gravitational influence would become impossible to ignore within the span of a generation or two. The pressure on the inner solar system would increase, leading to more erratic comet paths, more asteroid strikes, and eventually the full force of a planetary tide that would rearrange our oceans and geology. He closed the file on his screen, his hand hovering over the external drive containing the final encrypted package. He thought of his old mentor, Professor Davies, and his words: "The oldest stories are merely history written by witnesses who lacked the language to describe what they truly saw. The Sumerians saw the Great Crosser. Finch had merely provided the modern calculus for its return. But the story isn't over. The evidence is only the beginning. The real drama lies in what happens next. Do the Anunnaki return to reclaim their gold and their engineered species? What happens when a species discovers that its entire history is predicated on a lie, and its future is predetermined by celestial mechanics? If this content has utterly opened your mind, please comment below, "I reached the end." This helps us understand who truly seeks knowledge beyond the surface. Like the video, subscribe to the channel now, and activate the bell, because the next episodes will dive into the specific preparations being made by elite global powers. And don't leave without clicking the video now on screen. It is the logical continuation of this terrifying journey. The flat remained silent, save for the low hum of the computer cluster that held the cosmic secret. Finch knew that by releasing this data, he was trading his comfortable solitude for the harsh glare of global scrutiny. But the truth, he concluded, was far more important than any singular career. The fragmented trail of Comet 3I Atlas had led him not just to a new planet, but to the terrifying cyclical truth of human existence. The king of the heavens was returning, and the world was utterly, dangerously unprepared. The clock was ticking, measured by the accelerating velocity of the Anunnaki's world.